Unfortunately, a lot of my presentation has been covered by Joe and some others, so I think I'll just walk off stage right now because you're not going to learn much from me. But I was the Environmental Standards Division Chief when the Coast Guard regulations were first developed. I was also a liaison to EPA when the first Vessel General Permit was developed. So you can blame Joe for the Ballast Water Management Convention. You can blame me for the Coast Guard regulations and a small part of the EPA's Vessel General Permit. So I want to go over, just to expand a little bit on what Joe was talking about with regard to the Coast Guard regulations. It is absolutely imperative that you understand that the IMO resolution that delayed implementation of the convention does not apply at all to the Coast Guard regulations or to the EPA's Vessel General Permit implementation schedule. The two are completely independent of one another. Some of the differences between the convention and the Coast Guard regulations, Joe talked about, but I'll expand on. One of the most important differences that'll become more clear later is the Coast Guard adopted a living versus dead numeric standard for biological efficacy. The convention chose to use viable versus non-viable. Now, as a ship owner, you're probably thinking, I don't really care about that, and you probably don't, except when it comes time to actually purchase a system and determine if it's going to meet Coast Guard requirements. We know that the Coast Guard uses dry dock dates versus survey dates, and so those dates aren't always the same. So here's the Coast Guard's implementation schedule. It's the same as the Vessel General Permit implementation schedule, and as you can see, vessels that had 1,500 to 5,000 cubic meters ballast water capacity are already required to be in compliance with the discharge standard. How can they do that? Well, they can choose one of 5 methods. 99% of the vessels are going to either install a ballast water management system to comply with the discharge standard, or they're going to request a Coast Guard extension letter that allows them to continue ballast water exchange until there are adequate numbers of ballast water management systems that have been U.S. type approved. So we know the other significant difference between the convention and the Coast Guard regulations is the entire type approval process. The Coast Guard type approval process is very similar to G8, and in fact G8 was based on a very early preliminary edition of the Coast Guard's Environmental Technology Verification Protocol, which is contained in the regulations. One of the problems with G8 is their guidelines. So different administrations have interpreted them differently. Some have taken a very strict interpretation. Others have adopted a more lax interpretation. With the Coast Guard ETV protocol, there's very little latitude in how systems can be type approved. The ETV process has a much greater emphasis on scientific and statistical levels of confidence. It has a much heavier reliance on quality assurance and quality control procedures, and the test facility has to be completely independent of the ballast water management system vendor. That's not always the case under G8. And the process is anticipated to take about 18 to 36 months from the time the vendor initially decides he's going to go through the U.S. type approval process until he receives his type approval letter. Could be shorter in some instances, could be longer, depending upon the maturity of the particular company. So, as we know, that causes a problem for those vessels that are already required to comply with the regulations. So a vessel can do one of 2 things. It can request an extension, and at this point the Coast Guard has approved 100% of the extension requests that have been submitted. When I spoke to the Coast Guard on Friday, they had about 400 of them. Some of our clients are very concerned about the ships that are going to have to comply in early 2016. Coast Guard told me that they are working on those now and that they will probably have those done in the next 2 to 4 weeks. So if you're in that group of ship owners who has to comply in early 2016 and you've requested an extension, you should hopefully be receiving that in the next 2 to 4 weeks. The other thing about the extension requests is if you had an extension that went to 2016 or 2017, nothing prevents you from requesting another extension. It's not a one and done kind of thing. If the Coast Guard determines in 2016 that there still aren't enough type-approved ballast water management systems and you need one, then you can request another extension of the Coast Guard. As more U.S. type-approved ballast water management systems become available, the Coast Guard requirements for extension letters are going to become more stringent. As a ship owner, you're going to have to demonstrate why you can't install one of the systems that's been type approved. So the other option is to install an alternative management system. Alternative management systems are not type approval from the Coast Guard. There's been a lot of confusion regarding that. They are two different things. AMS is not a precursor to U.S. type approval. So there have been a lot of rumors that, well, if a system's received AMS, it's going to get U.S. type approval. That's not always the case. The other important thing to remember is many of these AMS were type approved 3 or 4 years ago. And the system, let's call it Model A, was type approved with a particular filter and a particular PLC and so forth. And since that time, the ballast water management system has been developed. They may have used a different filter, they may use a different PLC, they may use different materials, they may have configured it slightly differently. And that is, let's say, is Type C or Model C. And the ballast water treatment system vendor only intends on type approving Model C. If you bought Model A and installed it as an AMS, then once your 5 years runs out, you're stuck. So I encourage everyone to make arrangements with their ballast water vendor to ensure that if the model they bought is not the same as the model that is Coast Guard type approved, that a procedure has been worked out so that you're not left with a system that is only valid for 5 years. AMS is not for everybody. For example, in the scenario that's called the best case scenario, you could conceivably use a ballast water or an alternative management system through 2026. It's unlikely, but it's a possibility. But it's not for everyone. I spoke a little bit before about the UV challenge. I'll let some of my colleagues talk about that a little bit more later. UV treatment systems kill some organisms, but not all. And so the Coast Guard has to develop a process that is similar to the ETV process that has the same degree of scientific and statistical veracity when they are type approving these UV treatment systems. UV treatment systems, as you'll hear, have been in use in water treatment for decades. They're reliable. They have many advantages. But until the Coast Guard is able to determine what that procedure is, they won't be able to type approve any UV treatment systems. Okay, moving ahead to the Vessel General Permit. The Vessel General Permit issued by the EPA is not like anything you're familiar with. It's a permitting process that was designed 40 years ago for stationary landside facilities. When the EPA tried to convert that to ships, it had lots of problems. There are some good things about the VGP that are very similar to the Coast Guard regulations and the convention, but there are also some pretty significant differences. Most importantly, the Vessel General Permit relies almost totally on self-reporting, self-monitoring, self-inspections. So you as the ship owner are required to conduct these very frequent self-inspections. You're required to have a procedure for doing it. You're required to log all of those inspections and then submit an annual report to the EPA. When I spoke with the EPA on Monday, only 84% of ship owners out of the 55,000 ships that are covered under the permit have submitted their annual report. EPA is not sure yet what they're going to do in terms of enforcement. They couldn't give me an idea of how complete those reports were, but you can expect in the coming years that the EPA is going to be more and more strict in their enforcement of submission of the annual reports. And in particular, there's no mechanism in the Clean Water Act or the Vessel General Permit for issuing extensions. So on the one hand, you have one U.S. government organization, the Coast Guard, saying, we'll issue you an extension because we understand there's no type-approved systems. On the other hand, you have the EPA saying, we have the same implementation schedule, and you have to comply with it, and there's no exceptions. The EPA has said that they will adopt a low-priority enforcement, but it's unclear exactly what that means. So your options moving ahead are, for the Coast Guard, are either install an AMS or request an extension letter. For the EPA, essentially install an AMS or request an alternative individual permit, which is a very time-consuming process, or many ship owners have chosen to sue the EPA. And that's a common practice in the United States. It's not a practice that ship owners are particularly fond of or used to. There are some things coming down the pike with the EPA. With the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is required to review the discharge standard in January of 2016. As far as I know, they have not started that process yet. They also anticipate having a UV system protocol for testing in the next 6 to 12 months, possibly sooner. As far as the EPA, they need to develop a policy for noncompliance. They don't know what that policy is going to be. And they haven't been able to communicate that to the shipping industry. Keep in mind that the Vessel General Permit is renewed every 5 years. They will start that process in probably 2016. I strongly encourage you to get involved in that process, either as individual ship owners, as associations, with your flag administration, because by its very nature, the Vessel General Permit tends to get more strict each new iteration. And you can be guaranteed that environmental groups that are lobbying very hard for some of these standards to be more stringent will be sending lots and lots of letters and lots of comments to the EPA and the Coast Guard. So I strongly recommend through your associations to provide input to the U.S. government when it comes to their new regulations and changes. Thank you.